Coming up in this video, I'm going to show you how I paint the unmade warband for Warcry. Welcome back to Mini Junkie, everyone. My name is Jarrett. I got some interesting feedback in a comment the other day, and it said, in caps, less of your face and more of anything else. So yeah, that was pretty direct feedback, I thought, and pretty clear. So maybe there needs to be less of this and a little more of this. So maybe I'll try and keep my intros a little shorter. In this video, I'm going to be showing, like I said, how I paint my unmade warband. And as with so many of my videos, this is about getting them done to a nice, it's like tabletop plus, I hope. Not going to win awards, but looking really good and in a reasonable amount of effort and time. I also tried to record it while filming my voice while I was painting, and man, it's just constant technical issues. I don't know what the problem is, but it didn't work out so good. And half the audio didn't show up in the editor. So it's typical Jarrett narration for this one. Let's get right to the painting. All right, everyone, here's a look at the unmade that we're painting today. As usual, you kind of follow this along as a way of picking up some tips and techniques as opposed to literally following step by step, I would say. But hopefully you like the finished effect. I think they look pretty cool. Starting out with white primer, Vallejo Premium White is what I used. And then I'm coming in with Vallejo Metal Color Steel. It covers the white primer great, actually. It doesn't, usually metallics need some kind of black as an undercoat, but this stuff goes on beautifully. And what I like about it is it really runs into the, like when you see there's a lot of chains on these guys, and it really helps fill in the chain links very easily because it's pre-thinned for use in airbrushes. It just happens that it also brushes on great. I like the steel color as a dark color for which we're going to work up some rust, and then we're going to end up highlighting that to pull out the edges and points and whatnot. And all you're going to do is go through these in assembly line fashion and paint any of the metals with this steel color, or a gunmetal could also work, like a lead belcher. And they have a lot of little forks poking out of their clothes, little metal forky things, and shackles. So you want to really check over each guy, make sure you get all the metals. I actually missed a few shackles the first time around, even around their necks actually. Now I'm going to come in with Vallejo Model Wash Rust. I have dark rust, light rust, and just rust. And this, I just, right out of the bottle, I just brush it over all the various metal areas that we just did, except I wait for them to dry, of course. If you only have one of these, or I mean, frankly, you don't have to use these at all, but I'm going for like a tarnished look. They're not going to look super rusty, but they're going to give them a nice tarnished look. If you only have one, just use one. What I did is I went through each guy, used one color rust on a few different parts, and then went back and used a different color rust on a few of the other parts just to create some of that variation, some visual interest. And yeah, you can see how it goes on really easy. I'm not being very careful, frankly, and getting it all over the place and on other parts of the model, which we'll fix later. And yeah, just apply it and let it dry. Once again, though, this is going to flow nicely into the chains and any of the gaps because it's quite a runny wash, and you can see how I'm applying it over chainmail. It goes on pretty dark, but once it dries, it lightens up a fair bit, so don't panic if it looks too dark at first. Now once it's dry, I did go back on each model and apply a little bit more. Again, wait till it's dried for sure, because you don't want to brush off the work you originally did, but I brush it on to a few different areas where there's a bit more metal, like the parts where a weapon joins the limb or whatever, just anywhere I wanted to make a little bit more rust, again, just to create some visual interest. And here you can see how I've brushed it around parts of the cleaver, for example, and left the main area looking a little bit different. Coming in now with chainmail. This is a mid-tone silver, so something like a Runefang steel would work. And I wouldn't really call it dry brushing necessarily. What I'm doing is I'm frequently using like the edge of the tip of the brush, or the side of the brush, or painting on the spikes very carefully and manually, but just trying to pull out the details again. By running that silver over top of the dried rust that we applied in the previous step. And again, using the side of the brush as I run it along chain links or along the edge of of the weapons, but definitely leaving some of the rusty parts showing. When it came to these rounded scythe attachments on the Blissful one, I took an old brush and I kind of stippled that silvery color on because I wanted to create like a sharpened but rugged and rough looking edge, not beautiful silver edge. I wanted it to look like a pretty worn implement. As I'm working, every once in a while I'll have a point where I want to let something dry. Like in the previous step, I'm letting the metallics dry and I'm just going to go do something simple. In this case, running Basilicanum Gray from Contrast Paints over there. I think 3 of these guys have sort of like stone looking things that they're standing on, including the Blissful one. And honestly, I just ran Basilicanum Gray over it. I'm not trying to make amazing bases for these guys. I'm going for tabletop gameplay. But in the end, as long as you wick up any of the really heavy pooling, it looks great, looks fine to me. When I posted these on social media, people commented on the red looking nice and rich and vibrant, and it does. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but amusingly, it's super simple. All I did was paint this Flesh Terrors red over the white primer for the helmets, and eventually you'll see I'm going to use it in a couple other places on these guys. And right out of the pot, no thinning, that's it. Like, that's all I did, and then just let it dry. And I wasn't even super careful around the eyes and stuff. I just made sure to cover the entire helmet. So pretty simple step. With this particular head, if you use it, we want it to look like a face with all the skin peeled off. And so don't just paint the red on that helmet that he's lifting up over his face, but don't paint that Flesh Terrors red onto his actual face yet. Alright, so here we can see where we're at right now with the metallics, and you can see I've been quite messy with the rust, and it's gotten over a lot of the white areas that are eventually going to be taking some contrast paint, such as on this hood. So, very simple, we're going to come in, we're going to grab some white. In my case, I'm using P3 Morrow White, but you can use whatever you have. Maybe a little thinner to make sure it doesn't streak and clump up. I'm just going to paint over anywhere that we've got, excessive rusty or blotches, or even getting metals on areas you didn't want it. We're just cleaning up the white areas in preparation for using some more contrast paints, which generally need a white surface or a light colored surface. Any dark blotches we leave would probably show through the contrast paint. While the white's drying, we're going to take Agarros Dunes, and I'm going to blotch it all over the bases where you can see, like what I've actually used on the base is Dark Earth from Vallejo, but I intentionally primed that white when I primed the miniature, and that creates a very nice basis. I'm sorry, this is terrible filming on this one, but I think you understand what I'm doing. I'm basically just putting it all over the texture, this Agarros Dunes, and when it dries, it actually ends up being kind of a nice, almost a light brown looking color. And I come back in after it's dry, and I dry brush that with some Ushabti bone, and good to go. That's how I'm doing all my Warmade Warcry warband bases, and I think it's good to go for that consistency so that your warbands all look like they're fighting in the same place. More of my incredible red recipe, which is again Flesh Terrors red over the white, and I'm just applying it. This is purple on the official color scheme. I wanted to go for red because these guys are all about ripping off skin and being fairly grotesque, kind of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre come to Warhammer. So I just felt like that rich, bloody red color was going to look nice, not just on the helmets, but also on the Blissful one, and I used it. But feel free to use literally any color that you prefer. You can absolutely use a purple. If you wanted it purple, I'd probably use Shyish purple, which would be a little bit darker. Then what I'm doing is, for this, I guess, flesh skirts, I assume it's meant to be the skins of their enemies patched together into something resembling armor. And so what I decided is each patchwork is meant to be potentially a different victim, so it should have different shades of skin. And so if you just paint it all one color, it's not quite as interesting of an effect. And so I just went through and painted on each guy. I painted a few different panels with Guilliman Flesh, and then I do the same thing. I go back through the whole group after that's dried, and I paint the remaining panels with like a Dark Oath Flesh. And heck, if you have Fire Slayer's Flesh contrast paint, you can also grab that and work it in so that you've got all this different sort of quilt work of flesh and skin of their enemies that they are wearing as skirts, so to speak. I want this guy's face to look like he ripped it off and it's just a skull covered in like flesh and blood. So to do that, I created first the flesh tones that would show through. And so that's just Cadian flesh. I didn't show the bottle. It's a little bit thinned and just brushed it right on. And after this, I also filled up his mouth with Carroburg Crimson, which worked just fine. Looks like the inside of a mouth with a grayish red tongue. So that worked fine. We just let that dry for a while. So I guess I probably was using Dark Oath flesh in the previous steps. So that's dried on their skirts, and now I'm using Guilliman flesh on the other panels to create that patchwork effect. So nothing special here, and frankly not capturing it, doing a great job of capturing it on camera, but I think you get the idea. Just fill in all the remaining panels with other flesh tone. So the guys, you can kind of see the inside of their skirt between their legs, and it's going to be in shadow, so I wanted a slightly darker tone of flesh back there. So I just, look at this incredible camera work, I just filled it in with brown ink from Vallejo Game Color. Yeah, you can just use your imagination, but all I'm doing is painting it over those inner. I am going to make this, I'm going to fix this problem, guys, I swear. I'm going to start doing a better job of filming these things. Alright, so I don't show the bottle, but I'm going to use snakebite leather on the faces and any of the sort of, I guess, hands that are hanging down, because I decided to make it look kind of like cured leather, boiled leather sort of, as opposed to just skin, fresh skin that was ripped off. And so that also will differentiate it from the skin that they're wearing on the skirt area. Look at this, just really badly done job of getting it all over the areas beside it. But anyway, yeah, just went through each guy. And just for the face and just for the arms, if there were any hanging down, I used snakebite leather right out of the pot, no thinning. And I don't use this color anywhere else intentionally because it could create confusion between what is their own faces that they've, you know, cured and stretched, etc., and what is something else like a strap or whatever. So I made sure to only use this for this one effect. Next, I took Nuln Oil and just used a small brush to fill in their eye sockets and nose holes on their helmets. Super simple step. Use the brush to wick it out a little bit if it filled too much, because you don't want to just create a solid black hole, because they've got a couple of sort of toothy shapes inside their eye sockets. I also used Black Templar on all the cloth straps that weren't skin that we did in the previous step. So, and they have a surprising amount of these that are a little bit hard to realize if they're cloth or not, especially around their torsos, mixed in with all the chains and stuff. So you may want to take your time and make sure you're picking out the straps properly with this black color. And I obviously did it on the sandals as well, and the shoes. For the guy showing off his skinned face, we take Blood for the Blood God. This Cadian flesh tone has already dried. And I just paint over Blood for the Blood God, just one nice smooth coat, and then I wipe it off with my finger, leaving all of the raised areas looking like flesh and bone-ish, kind of, but lots of bloodiness and raw skin. I really dig how this ended up. I did go in and touch up like just under his nose there a little bit because it was a little too clean, but I really like how this looked, and it ends up shiny in the end, which is cool. For all the staffs of their weapons, or the long handles, just Cygor Brown right out of the bottle, painted over the handle. Very, very simple. Still getting mileage out of Flesh Terror's Red, I decided to do the two bannery looking things hanging off the Blissful One's arms in the same color to match his hood. I couldn't think of what other color to use, so that's what I went for, but feel free to experiment or use a different color if you prefer. Now I'm going to come in with Pallid Witch Flesh, and I'm going to go over all the different skin areas on these guys, meaning their actual skin of the dude himself or herself. Just covering up any blotchiness or stray paint that's gotten on there in preparation for a wash later. Then I'm taking chainmail again, so like a Runefang steel, and just painting in the little bits of hoop and spikes that they appear to have stretched their face over, because it's not meant to all be their skin. They use some kind of a framework to put their face on their belt. Having painted all the skin with that Pallid Witch Flesh, now here's how I'm doing the wash of contrast that I'm going to use for their skin. Very similar to how I did my iron golems actually, but I'm going to thin this a bit more. So you can see I'm putting in, I think about 6, so it's like a 2-to-1 mix of Guilliman Flesh and Magos Purple. And then I'm adding a couple of parts of the contrast medium. I'm going to mix it all up, and I think what happened is, like, I mixed it up and then felt it was still a little too dark, because I really want these guys to be quite pale with just a bit of shading. So I did come back with a little more of the contrast medium. So hopefully from the video you can kind of get a sense for what the mixture was, but it was, you know, Guilliman Flesh with a touch of Magos Purple, thinned down with the Lahmian medium to preserve their paleness, and then, as always, just brushed on. I tend not to glob it on as thick as say GW was recommended when they first marketed it. And I do tend to watch for pooling that doesn't look right and wick it up with my brush. So it's almost like a half glaze, half wash, but in the end I think it does a really good job of getting through these guys quickly and creating the skin tone I wanted. Don't do a good job of showing this one, but I took Skeleton Horde and just painted it over the skull that's at the top of the Blissful One. Then I take Pallid Witch Flesh. By now we've allowed the wash that we did to dry on their flesh, and I'm using Pallid Witch Flesh to highlight the raised areas of their muscles and any surfaces that are facing in an upward direction. So for example, you can see the calf on this guy, or his raised biceps, or his shoulders and whatnot. Also using this color to clean up any pooling that doesn't look right, where, you know, it should have just been plain skin, and it's, you know, a little bit of extra pooling has created a shadow where we don't want it. So this is just a neatening up step that you can do this after any contrast paint, really, if you find it creates blotchiness you didn't want. For that skull on the Blissful One, now that it has the Skeletal Horde has dried, I take a little Screaming Skull, slightly thinned with water, and just kind of pencil in some highlights on the cheekbones and the ridges of the eyebrows, give it a little bit of definition and pop. Guys have little lacerations or scars on their legs and arms, so I just took a little bit of Carroburg Crimson. I didn't even thin it. Maybe I should have. It's up for debate, but tabletop standard here. So I just ran a little bit of Carroburg Crimson over each of these little scars you see, and then wicked up any, you know, excess pooling that happened. But yeah, pretty straightforward. And then I also did it around anywhere that the metal has joined to flesh, just to create that feeling of it being kind of raw and sore. It struck me that the skin skirts maybe could use a little bit more differentiation from the rest of their pale skin, the pale skin of each warrior. So I just took Reikland Flesh Shade out of the bottle and just ran it over every single panel of the flesh that they're wearing. The undertones being different still manages to show through, but this does help darken them and pull them apart from the pale flesh that we did. You may have seen me do this before, but I take Vallejo Game ink and a fine point on my brush, and I just carefully, slowly do a dark line between certain areas that I want a bit of separation from. For example, the bottom of the skirts and the legs. I just wanted to create a sense of there being a bit of shading and gap there, and just separate various sections of the miniature, especially when it comes to these guys that I'm doing for gaming. That helps them actually be a little more readable visually on the tabletop when they've got these dark lines that are, you know, creating shapes on the miniature. So I like to do it, but again, it's easy to screw up because you can sometimes do a line that's a little too thick, but if you can manage to get the hang of it, it can create a nice effect, I think, so that I do it most of the time these days. I'm going to airbrush on matte varnish, and this is the type I use, Vallejo Premium Airbrush Matte Varnish. I do it after the tufts, and the reason is tufts can sometimes look plasticky and have a bit of an unnatural shine to them in the light. So this helps dull them down the way they should be because they're grass. And then I also did it on any of the red helmets or any of like the red of the Blissful Ones. hood, because that contrast paint does seem to have less durability, so it can rub off a little more easily than typical paint. I don't worry about it too much, but definitely contrast paints I do. And then I try to avoid any of the metallic areas. But we do the varnish before this last step, which is blood for the blood god and a tiny bit of black ink. The black ink's going to sit off on its own for a sec, and I take a stippling brush. In this case, it's an old brush where I snip the bristles in half. I take a little bit of that blood for the blood god, and I just stipple it on to wherever I think it, you know, makes sense. On these guys, definitely the weapons. And I prefer that over actually just hand brushing strokes, because I think brush strokes of this stuff doesn't look good. It looks fake to me. This creates a sense of built up blood and gore on the different weapons. Message ding. And then I try to put a little bit on parts of their bodies that would make sense if they got some splatter, but not overdoing it. So I don't want to cover these guys in blood, because it just creates a mess. I want it to look, you know, like it goes. I placed it where it belongs. Certainly on the two scythe weapons on this guy, because these are definitely, to me, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre group of Warcry, and so unlike certain war bands, I'm doing a lot more bloody weapons than I might normally, just because I think it's appropriate for these guys. Now, having made my way through the whole unit, the blood for the blood god on the weapons, etc., is now tacky. And while it's tacky, I mix a little bit of black. Well, okay, this is too much, I think, and so learn from my mistake. I could have used just a tiny bit less of this black ink, but what I want to do is mix it with some of that blood for the blood god to create a really dark blackish red color, and then I stipple that on, but definitely less than the previous step. So I want that red to dominate, but I want little bits and flecks of black gore to show in it. I feel like that looks a lot more natural, a lot more realistic than just the red by itself. I mean, in certain spots you could definitely just leave the red alone and that could look cool on its own, but I dig this like extra bit of dried gore, especially on something like this where this guy looks like he went full Negan on someone with this club. That's the final step, and no varnish after this, because we want that blood to look kind of wet and sticky. It's not too glossy and it's not too matte, it's just right, and it'll be durable. It won't rub off. There's not going to be a problem with that. That's it. This is the final unit. Here's a vaguely in focus, vaguely not turnaround. Hopefully you dig how they look. I think they look really cool for the time and effort spent. I am hoping to do the Corvus Cabal and the Splintered Fang if I can get time and get all the warbands done for Warcry, because I'm playing it with my sons actually, so I feel motivated to paint them. Plus, honestly, they're really kick-ass models and feel like something new for Age of Sigmar, which is great. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, if you did, consider sharing, liking, and heck, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing more. I don't have Patreon, but if you'd like to support the channel, I have a tip jar link below for PayPal. I always welcome and greatly appreciate any tips that I can use to, well, buy more paint, frankly. I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time.